Under the blinding heat of the frontier sun, the earth stretched out in every direction, dry, cracked, and endless. The wind carried no mercy, only the hiss of dust sliding over stone and the faint rattle of a dying bush. She pressed her hand to her swollen belly, her breath heavy as she trudged up the ridge. The desert had tested her for days, burning her hope as it burned her skin. Her horse had collapsed miles back, and her canteen held nothing but the sound of air. She was alone, or so she thought, until something on the hill caught her eye at first. She believed the shimmering haze was another trick of the heat. Poles, she thought, wooden stakes, jutting up like dead trees against the horizon. But then her vision steadied, and she felt her pulse climb. There were shapes at the top of that rise, tall, unmoving, dark against the bright sky. She shaded her eyes and stared harder. Then the wind shifted, and she saw them clearly. Her voice cracked through the dry air. "My God," she whispered. "They're men." Her heart began to pound. She clutched her belly as if to shield the child inside from what she might find. Every step closer felt like trespassing into something forbidden, a place where the living and the dead might share the same silence. The sand shifted under her worn boots. The poles grew larger, clearer. They weren't just wood. They were crosses. And the figures lashed to them, half-naked, sunburned, motionless, were not shadows. They were real men. She stopped, breath catching in her throat. The desert had turned into a graveyard. But then one of the figures moved. His head lifted slowly and his eyes met hers. In that instant, she forgot her thirst, her fear, even the pain that gripped her body. The world shrank to the space between them, a woman heavy with life and a man bound to a pole. Half dead yet still alive, the wind tugged at her dress as if urging her to turn back. But she couldn't. Something about the man's stare pinned her in place. His eyes were dark, sharp as obsidian, and full of a fierce strength that defied his suffering. His skin, bronzed and battered by the sun, glistened with sweat and dust. He was clearly a warrior, proud even in chains. Behind him, several others hung the same way, their long black hair whipping in the wind. Their bodies marked by tribal symbols and scars that spoke of battles fought long before this moment. She could tell they were Apache, and she knew what that meant in these lands. The settlers whispered stories of raids, vengeance, and blood. Yet standing there, looking at them, under the merciless sky, she didn't see savages. She saw men left to die, and one man who refused to surrender. Her instincts screamed at her to leave. A pregnant woman wandering near Apache warriors could only find trouble. But something stronger than reason kept her rooted. Maybe it was pity. Maybe it was fate. Or maybe it was the memory of another pair of eyes, her husband's, the day he rode away to trade in Santa Fe and never returned. She had searched the trails for weeks, only to find silence. Now, in this barren wasteland, she had found something she couldn't understand. A man who should have been dead, yet somehow was not. The man's lips moved, cracked and dry. No sound came out at first. Then, with great effort, he spoke a single word. She couldn't hear it clearly, but it sounded like a name or a prayer. She took a hesitant step forward, torn between fear and compassion. The other men didn't move, but their stillness was heavier than stone. She could feel their presence watching her, testing her. The poles had been planted deep into the sand, each with leather bindings hardened by heat. Whoever did this wanted them to suffer slowly. She saw vultures circling above, patient in their hunger. She bit her lip and looked around for any sign of those responsible soldiers. Bounty hunters? Maybe settlers seeking revenge? But the desert was empty. Only the sky and silence answered her. Her hand brushed against her belly again. The child kicked softly, reminding her that she was not just one life now, but two. She closed her eyes and whispered a prayer. When she opened them, the warrior was still staring at her. This time his voice reached her faintly. "Water," he rasped. It wasn't a command. It was a plea, stripped of pride. The sound cut through her heart like a blade. She hesitated, glancing at the empty canteen at her waist. She had nothing left to give. Yet something in his tone made her feel she couldn't just walk away. She stepped closer, her shadow touching the base of his pole. The heat shimmered between them. "I don't have water," she said softly, "but I can help free you." The man's eyes flickered, as if weighing her words against the dying sun. Behind him, one of the other bound warriors made a faint sound. A warning, perhaps. She turned and saw him watching too, his expression unreadable. She realized that whatever she did next would decide not just her fate, but her child's as well. The ropes around the warrior's wrists were thick and knotted, cutting into his flesh. She reached up and tried to loosen one, but it wouldn't budge. Her hands trembled. He spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. "Knife," he said, and nodded toward a broken blade half buried in the sand. She looked around, found it glinting weakly in the light, and bent to pick it up. The handle was scorched, the edge dull, but it might still cut through leather. She started sawing at the rope, her breath coming in ragged bursts. Each strand gave way with a dry snap. When the final binding broke, his body sagged forward. She caught his arm instinctively, startled by the weight of him, solid, muscular, and burning hot from the sun. He looked down at her, eyes half closed, as if unsure whether she was real. The desert wind grew stronger, whipping her hair into her face. She didn't notice the movement behind her until it was too late. One of the other men had freed himself just enough to drop his head and let out a low, guttural sound, not anger, but something between warning and despair. She turned sharply, scanning the horizon again. That's when she saw dust rising in the distance. Riders. A whole line of them. Her heart seized. Soldiers, maybe. Or bounty men. Whoever they were coming fast. The warrior followed her gaze and tried to stand, but his legs buckled beneath him. She helped him as best she could, her mind racing. She didn't even know his name. She didn't know if he was friend or foe. But she knew one thing. If those riders reached them and saw her with him, she would be condemned alongside him. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the sand. The sound of hooves grew louder. The warrior gripped her wrist weakly, his fingers rough but steady. "Hide," he murmured, but she shook her head. "I can't leave you." He looked at her for a long moment, the corners of his mouth tightening into something that might have been a smile or sorrow. Then his gaze shifted past her, toward the coming storm of men. The riders were close now, their outlines forming against the setting sun. She could see the glint of rifles, the flash of dust on boots. Fear twisted inside her, but so did something else resolve. The unborn child inside her kicked again. As if feeling the tension in her blood, she turned to the warrior, his strength fading but his eyes still burning. "Tell me what to do," she said. He looked at her, silent for a heartbeat, then whispered a word that made her blood run cold, a word that hinted at a secret far greater than the desert around them. Before she could ask what it meant, the sound of gunfire split the air, and that was when everything changed. The gunfire cracked across the open, desert-like thunder tearing through heaven. She froze, the sound slicing the silence she had walked in for days. The riders were close enough now for her to see the dull shine of metal, the kick of hooves and the hard faces bent low against the wind. Dust rose behind them like a curtain. The warrior beside her lifted his head with effort, his breathing shallow, but his eyes burning alive again. She crouched beside him, one arm over her belly, one gripping the knife still warm in her hand. He said nothing, but the look in his eyes spoke clearly. They had to move. His arm slid across her shoulder as he struggled to stand. His weight was heavy, but she braced herself, feeling his heart hammering against her side. Every step they took away from the poles felt like stealing from death. Behind them, the other Apache men watched, silent and still, their fates written in the desert wind. They slipped behind a ridge where the sand rose like a wave frozen in time. The riders came into view then, 6 of them, their long coats flapping, dust masks pulled high over their faces. The woman could make out the stripes of uniform beneath, the pale glint of badges. Soldiers, she thought. Or maybe militia. The kind that hunted Apache prisoners and left them tied to die slow under the sun. The warrior gripped her wrist, forcing her to kneel beside him. His voice was rough but steady. "Don't move," he whispered. She nodded, her heart pounding so loudly she thought it might give them away. Through the slit between rocks, she saw the soldiers stop near the poles. One dismounted, spat into the dust, and kicked at a lifeless body. Another shaded his eyes, scanning the ridge where she hid. She pressed her hand over her mouth. The heat was unbearable, the air dry and thick with gunpowder and fear. One of the soldiers barked something she couldn't hear. Two others started cutting down the poles, letting the dead fall like broken statues. The sight made her stomach twist. The warrior's hand trembled slightly on her arm. His jaw tightened, but his eyes never left the men. There was hatred in them, deep and quiet, like coals beneath ashdod. Then one of the soldiers shouted and pointed. They had found the footprints. Her footprints. The trail she had left dragging him away from the poles. She cursed herself silently. The leader swung into his saddle and gave an order. The rest mounted fast, rifles ready, turning toward the ridge. She could feel the ground trembling under the weight of hooves. The warrior pushed himself upright, gripping a jagged piece of rock as support. "Run," he said, and started toward a narrow cut between the hills. But she didn't move at first. Her legs refused. She looked at him, a man barely alive, his back torn, his wrists raw, and couldn't believe he still had the strength to lead. Then instinct took over. She ran. The wind tore at her dress as she stumbled after him, clutching her belly. They slid down a slope into a dry wash, choked with mesquite and stone. The sound of horses grew fainter behind them, muffled by the ridges. When they stopped, both of them gasped for breath, their skins slick with sweat. The warrior leaned against a boulder, his chest rising and falling heavily. His face was shadowed now, his hair hanging over his eyes. "Who are they?" she asked, her voice low. "Soldiers," he said after a pause. "Not from here. They take men from the tribes and hang them. They call it justice." His tone carried the weight of someone who had seen it too many times. She wanted to ask what he had done to deserve the poles, but something in his eyes stopped her. There was no shame there, only defiance. The heat pressed down like a living thing. She took off her shawl and wrapped it around his arm, where the ropes had cut deep. The wound was angry and raw. He watched her closely but said nothing. For a long time, the only sound was the desert, the whisper of wind, the cry of a hawk circling overhead. When he finally spoke again, his voice had softened. "You shouldn't have helped me," he said. "They'll hunt you too." "I was already lost," she replied, her eyes fixed on the horizon. "Maybe saving you was the only thing left to do." The words hung between them, heavy with something neither could name. He studied her for a moment, his gaze dropping to her rounded belly. "Your child?" he murmured. "How far?" "Soon," she said quietly. "Maybe days." He nodded slowly, as if the answer confirmed something he already knew. "Then we keep moving before night. There's a canyon ahead. We can hide there." She looked down at her swollen feet, at the endless sand stretching before them. "You can barely stand," she said. He turned his face toward the wind, the hint of a smile crossing his lips. "I've walked through worse." They moved again, following the dry channel until the sun began to sink. The light softened, turning the sand red like spilled blood. Each step took them farther from the world she had known and deeper into one she didn't understand. The warrior said little, conserving what strength he had left. She watched him when he didn't see the way he carried himself, even when broken. How his silence spoke more than words. As the shadows grew longer, they reached a cluster of rocks that offered a small hollow for shelter. He gestured for her to sit while he scouted the edge of the canyon. When he returned, he brought with him a handful of cactus fruit and a flat piece of flint. He cut the fruit open, handing her half. It tasted bitter but wet. It was the first thing she'd had in nearly 2 days. "Thank you," she said. He didn't reply. He sat across from her. The glow of sunset catching the markings on his chest, faded ink lines that told stories she couldn't read. She wanted to ask about them, about who he was before the poles. But something told her the answer would not come easily. Finally, she broke the silence. "What did they call you?" He looked up slowly. "They call me things that mean nothing," he said. "But among my people, I am known by a name you would not understand." "Then tell me," she pressed gently. He hesitated, then said a word that rolled off his tongue like wind through canyon stone. It carried power, though she couldn't repeat it. "It means the one who walks through fire," he explained. She swallowed hard. "And that's what they did to you?" He nodded once. "They wanted me to give them my people. I did not." The weight of his words settled deep in her chest. She could feel the layers of his suffering, his pride, his unyielding will. She had heard stories of Apache warriors, fierce, untamed, deadly, but this man was different. There was sorrow behind his strength, a quiet knowing that came from loss too deep to measure. Night fell slowly. The desert cooled, the stars emerging one by one. She leaned back against the stone, exhaustion tugging at her eyelids. The warrior sat awake, watching the horizon. Every few minutes, he glanced toward the east, listening. She realized he wasn't resting. He was waiting. She whispered, "Do you think they'll find us?" "They will look," he said. "But the desert hides those who belong to it. And me?" He turned to her, his eyes meeting hers. "You don't belong here. But maybe you were meant to." Something stirred in her at those words. A feeling she couldn't explain, like she had stepped into a story written long before she arrived. The child inside her moved, kicking lightly, as if sensing the truth of it too. Far off, a coyote cried. The sound echoed through the rocks, lonely and sharp. She pulled the shawl tighter around her shoulders and closed her eyes, though sleep would not come. Her mind replayed the moment she had found him, the poles, the soldiers. The word he had whispered before the gunfire, a word that still haunted her, though she couldn't recall its exact shape. In the distance, faint and steady, came the rhythm of hooves again. The warrior's head snapped up, his body tensed. She saw his hand move to a stone beside him, gripping it like a weapon. She sat up quickly, her heart leaping to her throat. He motioned for silence. The sound drew closer, echoing through the narrow canyon walls. Then came voices, faint, but not in English. He listened, his expression darkening. "Who is it?" She whispered. "Not soldiers," he said, his eyes narrowing. "My people." Her pulse raced. Relief washed through her at first, until she saw the way his jaw clenched. Something was wrong. "They won't trust you," he said. "You helped me. That makes you one of them." She froze. The meaning sank in slowly. He wasn't warning her about danger from soldiers anymore. He was warning her about the people he called his own. The fire between them flickered low. She could see the reflection of movement on the rocks, figures slipping through the shadows. The warrior rose to his feet, swaying slightly, but standing tall. "What are you going to do?" she asked. He looked down at her, his face unreadable. "I'll speak for you," he said. "If they let me." "What?" The voices grew louder, closer. The desert night seemed to hold its breath. She pressed her hand to her belly again, praying for the strength to face whatever came next. And when the first of the figures stepped into the dim firelight, her heart stopped, for the face that appeared was not one of an enemy, but of a man she thought she'd never see again. For a moment, she couldn't breathe. The firelight trembled against the rocks, showing a face she had carried in memory and grief for months. It was her husband, or at least the man she had buried in her heart is gone. His hair was longer now, streaked with dust and tied back in the Apache style. His skin was darker, his clothes rough, his eyes harder than she remembered. But the scar above his cheekbone, the one from the time he'd fallen fixing the barn roof, was still there. She whispered his name, but it sounded strange in the night air, like a word that no longer belonged. He didn't answer. He just stood there, framed by the glow, with two other Apache men at his side. One held a bow, the other a rifle that looked older than war itself. Behind them, more shadows moved, circling like wolves, deciding whether to trust or kill. The warrior she had freed stood between her and them, his back straight, his voice calm but firm as he spoke in his language. The men listened without moving. The only thing she understood was the weight of their stares. Her husband, or the man who used to be him, finally stepped closer. "You shouldn't be here," he said quietly, his English rougher now. "This land doesn't forgive those who wander without reason." She stared at him, unable to form words. I came looking for you, she finally managed. I thought you were dead. His eyes softened for the briefest moment, then hardened again. Maybe I am. The words hit her harder than any bullet. She reached for him, but he stepped back. The warrior beside her turned his head slightly, studying the exchange. There was tension in the air thick enough to choke on. She could sense it. Something had bound these two men before she ever arrived. Something dark and unfinished. The other Apache spoke, sharp and quick. Her husband answered in the same tongue, his voice rising. It wasn't the argument of strangers. It was something old, heavy with betrayal. She could hear it in their tone even if she didn't know the words. Then silence fell. The man she had saved turned toward her and said quietly, "He was with the soldiers who tied us." Her heart twisted. "That's not true," she said, but her husband's eyes didn't deny it. "They came for trade," he said. "They said they only wanted food, medicine, horses. But when the council refused, they opened fire. I tried to stop it." The warrior stepped closer, his jaw tight. "You gave them our camp. I saved who I could." Her husband snapped, "You think I wanted this?" The others began murmuring, voices low and dangerous. The woman looked from one to the other, her pulse pounding. She didn't understand everything, but she knew enough. The man she had loved had somehow become part of the people who had suffered, and maybe part of the reason they were dying. The child inside her kicked hard, almost as if sensing the storm around them. She pressed her hand over her belly, whispering for calm. But the desert was no place for peace tonight. The oldest Apache among the group stepped forward, his face carved by age and fury. He spoke slowly, each word weighted with anger. The warrior translated for her. "He says they will decide what to do with both of you by sunrise." She swallowed. "Both of us." "You helped me," the warrior said simply, "and he thinks your husband betrayed them. The spirits will judge who belongs and who dies." The words settled like cold iron in her chest. She wanted to scream, to run, to wake up somewhere green and alive. But there was no running from this place. The fire crackled between them, sending sparks into the night. Her husband came closer again, lowering his voice. "Listen to me," he said. "I didn't mean for this to happen. I stayed behind because I thought I could protect the camp. They saw me as a traitor. I barely escaped, then why didn't you come home?" she asked. "Why leave me to walk through the desert alone?" He looked down. There was no home left. The silence between them was unbearable. Behind him, the others prepared a small circle of stones, the kind she had seen once before. When the old preacher in her village buried a man without a coffin, except this circle wasn't for the dead. It was for judgment. The warrior motioned for her to sit. She obeyed, though her legs trembled. He knelt beside her, whispering something she couldn't quite catch. "Do not show fear," he said. "They will test you." "What kind of test?" "The kind that shows who you are when the earth takes your voice away."
Oh.
The meaning frightened her more than the words. The others gathered around, chanting low, their faces painted with ash. The air grew thick with smoke and drum beats, the hollow rhythm of something ancient and merciless. Her husband stood apart, his head bowed, his hands bound by a strip of leather. The warrior, though still weak, stood unflinching in the circle's edge. As the chant rose, one of the elders stepped forward with a bowl of red clay mixed with water. He dipped his fingers and marked her forehead with it. "Life and death share the same blood," the warrior translated softly. "They ask the spirits to see which side your heart belongs to." The heat of the fire pressed against her skin. She closed her eyes, feeling the weight of everything, her child, her choices, her love, her fear. Somewhere deep within, a memory stirred. Her husband's laughter when he had built the cabin. The promise they made to raise their child far from the wars of men. That promise now lay buried under the desert dust. When she opened her eyes again, the elder had turned to her husband. He spoke, and the others nodded grimly. The warrior's voice came low. "They say if he speaks truth, the wind will rise. If he lies, the fire will die." Her husband lifted his chin and began to speak. His words flowed like a river that had been dammed too long. He told them about the soldiers, about the trade gone wrong, about the captain who had promised peace but brought rope and bullets instead. He told them how he'd tried to warn the Apache, but no one would listen. And finally, told them how he saw the poles being raised and could do nothing but turn away. The flames wavered but did not die. The wind stirred faintly, carrying dust into the circle. The elders murmured, unsure. The warrior stared at the fire, his eyes shadowed. Maybe the spirits still doubt, said. Then one of the younger men stepped forward, the same one who had held the rifle. He pointed at her belly and said something sharp. The warrior's expression darkened. What did he say? She whispered. He says the child should be tested too, the warrior replied. That it carries the blood of the man who betrayed them. Her heart stopped. No, she said, voice breaking. This child hasn't even seen the world. But the circle had already tightened. Her husband shouted something in their tongue, struggling against his bonds, but they didn't move. The elder raised his hand for silence. The woman's breath came fast, panic clawing at her chest. The warrior stepped closer, his body shielding her slightly. I will not let them harm you, he said quietly. You can't stop them, she whispered. His jaw tightened. Maybe not all of them, but I can try. The tension broke like thunder when a shot rang out from the dark. The fire exploded in sparks as a bullet slammed into the stones nearby. Chaos erupted, shouts, movement, the crack of more gunfire echoing through the canyon. The soldiers had found them again. The Apache scattered for cover, returning fire. Her husband lunged toward her, cutting his bonds on a sharp rock, and grabbed her arm. Run, he shouted. The warrior caught her other arm, his eyes fierce. For a heartbeat, she stood between them, the man she had loved and the man she had saved, both pulling her in different directions while the world burned around them. Another bullet whined past her ear. She tore free, clutching her belly, and stumbled toward the rocks. The warrior followed close behind, firing a rifle he'd snatched from the ground. Her husband turned to fight, shouting something she couldn't hear before vanishing in the smoke. They ran through the canyon until her lungs burned. The ground shook with the roar of hooves and gunfire. The warrior grabbed her hand, pulling her behind a ledge. They crouched low as the sound of battle filled the night. When it finally faded, the desert went silent again. She dared to lift her head. The camp was in flames behind them. The horizon glowed red like dawn, though it was still dark. The warrior's breath came hard. They won't stop, he said. Not until we're all gone. She turned toward him, tears cutting through the dust on her face. What about him? The warrior didn't answer. His silence said enough. The wind shifted, carrying the smell of smoke and blood. She pressed her hand to her stomach and looked up at the stars, whispering a prayer into the endless dark. Somewhere behind them, the sound of a single horse galloping rose again, closer this time, relentless. The night was far from over. The sky was still burning red when they reached the ridge, breathless and covered in dust. The wind carried the smoke of the destroyed camp, mixing with the smell of gunpowder and blood. She stumbled, her hand gripping the rock for balance, as the pain in her lower back sharpened. The warrior turned back quickly, catching her before she fell. His skin was streaked with ash, his eyes dark and fierce under the moonlight. You can't stop now, he said. They'll follow the tracks before sunrise. She nodded weakly, her breath shaking. Every step sent a sharp pulse through her body. The child inside her was restless, moving as if aware of the danger outside. The warrior lifted her gently, his strength surprising despite his wounds. He carried her up the rocky incline, his feet steady even on the loose stones. The silence between them was thick, heavy with exhaustion and unspoken fear. When they reached the top, the desert opened before them, endless, ghostly under the pale light. In the distance, faint torches flickered like fireflies. Soldiers, she turned her head and whispered, "They're not giving up." "They won't," he said. "They think you're their proof, a settler woman with an Apache man. To them, that's worse than treason." She looked at him, trying to read the meaning behind his words. There was something different in his tone now, softer, but carrying a warning. "And what do your people think of me?" she asked quietly. He didn't answer right away. "They think the desert tests the heart. Some break, Some are remade. You saved me when you didn't have to. That means something, even if they don't see it. She closed her eyes, the weight of his voice grounding her. You said the spirits would judge, she murmured. Maybe they already are. They rested briefly in a hollow carved by wind and time, hidden from view. The warrior used his knife to slice open a cactus, offering her the moisture inside. She drank, the bitter taste cutting through her parched throat. He stayed still beside her, watching the horizon with an expression she couldn't read, somewhere between wariness and regret. When the first light of dawn touched the sand, the sound of hooves began again, distant but closer than before. The warrior rose, scanning the land. We need to move north, he said. There's an old mining camp beyond those hills. If we reach it, we can lose them in the tunnels. She struggled to stand, her legs trembling under the weight of exhaustion. And then what? She asked. Then we see if fate still remembers mercy, he said. They moved through the canyons, following dry riverbeds where the sand muffled their steps. The sun climbed higher, burning through the thin layer of morning mist. Every sound, every echo, every bird call felt sharper, as if the desert itself were watching. The warrior stopped suddenly and knelt. His hand brushed the ground. Tracks, he said. Not soldiers, horses. Apache, her heart skipped. Your people. He nodded, his jaw tightening. If they survived the attack, they're heading the same way. But if they see me with you now, they might think you led the soldiers. She felt her stomach twist. Then what do we do? We keep going, he said, but stay close. They climbed another ridge, and from the top, they could see the ghost of a settlement below, a scattering of wooden frames, its collapsed roofs, and a mine shaft half buried in sand. It looked abandoned, but smoke rose faintly from the far side. Someone had been there recently. The warrior motioned for her to stay low. He crept forward, silent as shadow, until he disappeared behind the slope. Minutes stretched like hours. She crouched, every nerve in her body alive. The baby moved again, harder this time. Sweat beaded on her forehead. Then the warrior returned, his expression grim. There are men inside, he said. Soldiers. 3 of them. They're wounded but alive. She swallowed hard. If they see us, they won't, he said. Not if we move before they wake. But fate didn't wait. A sound cracked the stillness, a horse whinnying somewhere near the mine. The warrior stiffened, pulling her behind a broken cart. Voices echoed across the sand, rough and slurred from fatigue. The soldiers were awake. One limped out of the mine, his rifle hanging loose in his hand. Another followed, dragging a wounded leg. The warrior's eyes flicked toward her. Stay here, before she could protest. He slipped away, vanishing between the shadows. She watched, her breath trapped in her chest. He moved like a ghost, circling behind the soldiers. Then one of them turned too soon, and the silence shattered. A shout rang out. The warrior lunged, knocking the man to the ground. The rifle went off, the shot echoing through the canyon. The second soldier fired blindly, the bullet splintering the wood beside her. She pressed against the sand, covering her head. The gunfire stopped as quickly as it started. When she dared to look up, both soldiers were down. The warrior stood over them, chest heaving, his knife dripping red into the dust. He wiped the blade and turned to her, his face unreadable. We can't stay here, he said. The noise will bring more. But before they could move, a voice came from the mine, one she recognized instantly. Stop. She froze. The light caught the figure stepping out, her husband. His clothes were torn, his face streaked with soot and blood, but he was alive. He looked at her, then at the warrior. The silence between them stretched, brittle and dangerous. You should have left when you had the chance, her husband said. They'll come back, and when they do, neither of you will make it. The warrior raised his chin slightly. You brought them here, he said. I brought them to stop this war, her husband replied, but you wouldn't listen. There's no peace built on chains, the warrior shot back. The woman stepped forward, her voice shaking. Enough, both of you. We don't have time for this. But they didn't hear her. The air crackled with years of pain and unfinished truth. She could see it in their faces, the old trust, the betrayal, the shared loss. They had once fought side by side, she realized, maybe even as brothers under the same sky, before the world split them apart. Her husband took a slow step closer. "You think saving her means redemption?" he said. "You think that changes what you did?" The warrior's hand tightened on the knife. "You don't understand what was taken from us." "I lost everything too," her husband said. "I lost her." The words hit her like a blow. She looked between them, torn by a pain she couldn't voice. The warrior's gaze flickered toward her, his expression softening just for an instant before hardening again. The sound of distant riders broke the moment. The soldiers were returning. Her husband's face paled. "We have to hide in the shaft," he said. "It goes deep enough to keep us out of sight." The warrior hesitated, then nodded. They moved quickly, dragging what supplies they could into the dark mouth of the mine. Inside, the air was cold and damp, carrying the scent of old earth and rusted metal. The narrow tunnel stretched deep, fading into shadow. They lit a lantern and moved deeper until the outside light vanished. The woman leaned against the wall, breathing heavily. The pain in her belly had grown sharper. The warrior noticed and crouched beside her. "You need rest," he said. "I can't," she whispered. "It's starting." Her husband turned sharply. "No, not now." She looked up at him, sweat running down her temples. "It doesn't wait for anyone." The sound of hooves thundered above, shaking the ground. Dust rained from the ceiling. The warrior pressed a finger to his lips, signaling silence. They waited, hearts pounding in unison. Voices echoed faintly from the mouth of the mine. The soldiers had arrived. One called out orders, his tone clipped and cold. The others began spreading out. Boots crunched over gravel. The echo grew louder. The light of a torch flickered near the entrance. The warrior gestured for her husband to douse their lantern. Darkness swallowed them whole. In the blackness, she could hear only her breath and the slow drip of water somewhere far inside. Then footsteps. Close. Too close. The warrior gripped his knife. Her husband picked up a rusted pickaxe, holding it tight. She tried not to move, every muscle screaming in fear. The soldiers' voices grew louder, their torches glowing faintly at the end of the passage. Then, without warning, a sound ripped through the silence, a low rumble deep in the earth. The mine trembled, stones falling from above. One of the soldiers shouted in panic. The ground cracked beneath their feet. The woman screamed as the walls shook violently. The warrior threw himself toward her. Shielding her as part of the ceiling collapsed. Dust filled the air. She could hear shouting, gunfire, the roar of the cave-in growing louder. And then, through the chaos, came a sound that made her blood run cold. Her husband calling her name. His voice fading beneath the thunder of falling rock. The lantern crashed to the ground, shattering in the darkness. The warrior's grip tightened around her as the world above them caved in. The light died completely, leaving only the echo of collapsing stone and the pounding of her heart. Somewhere beyond the wall of dust and ruin, the soldier screamed. Then there was nothing but silence, deep, endless, and alive with the weight of what was coming next. When the shaking finally stopped, the mine was silent. The air was thick with dust, and every breath burned like smoke. She lay still for a long moment, listening to the faint drip of water somewhere deep below and the pounding of her own heart. The warrior's arm was around her, his body shielding hers from the falling stone. She touched his shoulder lightly. "Are you alive?" she whispered. He stirred, groaning softly. "Still here," he said, his voice hoarse. "You," she nodded, though her body ached. "I think so." He pushed himself up slowly, the dim light from the collapsed tunnel above barely enough to see by. The entrance was gone, buried under rock and earth. They were sealed inside. She looked toward the direction where her husband had been when the cave gave way. There was no sound, no voice calling back. Only the stillness of death. Her throat tightened, tears cutting through the dust on her cheeks. The warrior didn't speak, only bowed his head briefly, as if honoring the fallen in silence. For a long while they said nothing. The air was heavy, their bodies trembling from exhaustion and grief. But then she felt it, a sharp pain that tore through her stomach. She gasped, clutching her belly. The warrior turned instantly. "What is it?" "It's time," she managed to say. "The baby? It's coming." The realization hit him like thunder. He looked toward the blocked tunnel, then back at her. "We can't stay here," he said. "You'll suffocate before dawn." She shook her head weakly. "I can't move." The warrior's hands trembled as he searched for light, finding a half-broken lantern still glowing faintly among the debris. He set it beside her and tore a strip from his shirt, soaking it with what little water he had left. He pressed it to her forehead, his voice steady despite the fear in his eyes. "Breathe," he said. "You've walked through fire and storm. You'll walk through this too." She gritted her teeth, her cries echoing through the mine. The earth felt alive, pulsing with her pain, her strength, her desperate will to bring life where so much death had gathered. The warrior stayed beside her, his hands shaking but steady enough to help. Hours passed like minutes until the sound of a newborn's cry broke through the darkness. She held the tiny child to her chest, tears mixing with the dust. The warrior looked down at the baby, awe softening his face. "A son," he said quietly. She smiled faintly through her exhaustion. "He's all that's left of both worlds," she whispered. The warrior wrapped the child in his own scarf, his expression unreadable. "Then he carries more than blood," he said. "He carries promise." The lantern flickered, its flame growing weaker. The air was running thin. The warrior rose, scanning the walls for any weakness. "There must be another way," he said. He found a narrow crack leading upward, where a thin stream of light filtered through. It was small, but it was something. He took a breath, grabbed his knife, and began digging through the stone with his bare hands. She watched, her strength fading, the baby's small breath soft against her skin. Every scrape of metal on rock echoed like a heartbeat. Finally, a chunk of stone broke free, and daylight pierced through. The warrior looked back at her, his face streaked with sweat and dirt. "Hold on," he said. "We're getting out." He widened the hole until it was just large enough for her to fit through. Then, carefully, he lifted her with the baby in his arms, pushing them toward the light. The morning sun hit her face like a blessing. She blinked against its brightness, gasping for air that finally felt alive again. He climbed out after her, collapsing beside them on the sand. The world around them was silent. The soldiers were gone. The fire had burned itself out. The desert lay still, vast and endless, as if nothing had ever happened. For a long time they said nothing. She looked at the horizon, the same line where she had once thought she saw poles rising against the sky. Now, all that stood there were broken shapes, reminders of the men who had suffered. Her husband's memory lingered like the heat in the sand, sharp but fading. She whispered a prayer for him. For forgiveness neither of them could ever give in life. The warrior turned his face toward the sun, eyes half closed. His breathing was slow but steady. "You should go east," he said. "There's a river 2 days from here. You'll find a trading post. Tell them you're a widow. They'll help you." She looked at him, sensing what he wasn't saying. "What about you?" He gave a faint smile. "The desert has always known me. I will walk where the wind leads." "You can't go back," she said softly. "Your people think you're dead." He met her eyes. "Maybe that's how it's meant to be." She wanted to argue, to ask him to come with her, but the words wouldn't form. She understood some souls belonged to the land, to the silence between sunrise and dusk. He was one of them. She reached out and took his hand, her fingers trembling. "If I live to see him grow," she said, looking down at her son, "I'll tell him about the man who saved us both." The warrior's eyes softened. "Tell him he was born in fire and that he must walk with truth. That's all any man can do." He stood slowly, his figure tall against the rising light. The wind tugged at his hair, carrying the faint sound of something distant. Maybe thunder, maybe memory. He turned toward the west, where the land rose in red and gold ridges, and began to walk. She watched until he was only a shadow against the desert sky. Then she looked down at her child again, tracing the small curve of his cheek. The baby stirred, reaching a tiny hand toward the sunlight. She rose, holding him close, and began walking east. Her steps were slow, but steady. The sun climbed higher, painting the sand in gold. Behind her, the wind erased their footprints, leaving only silence, the kind that comes after everything has been broken and remade. As the day grew brighter, the pain of loss softened, replaced by a quiet strength she didn't know she still had. The child slept peacefully in her arms. Each step she took felt lighter, though the road ahead was long. The world was still harsh, still dangerous, but she no longer feared it. When she reached the top of the last hill, she turned for one final look. The desert stretched endlessly, glowing beneath the sun. Somewhere out there walked a man who had once been bound to die, but found life again in saving another. Somewhere beneath the earth rested the man she had loved, whose choices had built the bridge between two worlds, one of survival, one of forgiveness. She whispered a prayer into the wind, her voice barely audible. May the land remember them. Then she turned and began her descent toward the river, where the horizon shimmered like hope. Days later, when the traders found her wandering with the child in her arms, they said she looked like someone who had walked through both death and dawn. They asked where she had come from, and she only smiled faintly and said, "From where the poles once stood." No one understood what she meant, but those words stayed with them. Years later, when travelers passed through that stretch of land, they spoke of strange wooden crosses half buried in sand, and a lone figure sometimes seen walking. At dusk, a man with long black hair and eyes that caught the fire of the setting sun. The story became a whisper of the desert, of a woman who defied death, of a warrior who rose from dust, and of a child born between two worlds. And on nights when the wind blew soft across the plains, it carried the sound of that long-ago cry. The moment life returned to a place that had once known only silence, the woman never forgot the man who had helped her survive, nor did she forget the one she had lost. But as her son grew and the years passed, she learned what both had taught her in their own way, that even in a world torn by fire, a heart that keeps walking can still find peace. In the end, the desert took back its secrets, but it left behind one truth carved in the wind, that love and redemption are never truly buried. They rise again like dawn over the endless sand.